Hey there, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Real Estate Recess. It is Thursday, March 21st, and I'm your hostess with the mostest, Jennifer Schurter. Have a big episode for you today. We are going to be breaking down what is actually happening with this National Association of Realtors settlement. And to join me for this conversation, I am really excited to introduce my friend Bekki Lowrance. She's a real estate agent there in Nashville, and I'm really excited for you, Bekki, to share your insights with the folks who are watching today, because this is such a huge story and there's so much chatter about it. Some of it's correct and a lot of it is completely incorrect.
100%. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So before we get started, why don't you give the people a little bit of an intro into who you are and in your business?
Sure. I am a Nashville real estate agent and have been an agent for, I guess, going on 8 years now. I cover the Middle Tennessee area. My favorite people, I'll work with anybody, but my favorite people ideally to work with are new first-time home buyers moving to the Nashville area. I love getting them acclimated to our city and all that it has to offer. We have, about 100 people a day moving to the area. So I've had a lot of opportunity to do just that. And I could not love what I do any more than I was created to do this.
That's awesome.
It's awesome. Yeah.
That is fantastic. I'm really glad to have you on here because I think that you are just as a broker, as an agent, you are just, well, I don't know in Tennessee, maybe they don't call you brokers, but as an agent, I feel like you're just an exceptional agent and such a great advocate for your clients and so knowledgeable. And that's why I'm really excited to have you be part of this conversation. So there's so much to unpack. So let's just get started with this. So this National Association of Realtors settlement, where did that even come from? Because I'm sure people watching this are like, all of a sudden this settlement is number one news story, top news, all this stuff's happening. So what started all of that? And so you probably remember it, Bekki, the Sitzer-Burnett case that's been going on since 2017.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, and essentially that kind of came to a head last year in October. And they were, they kind of made some judgments, if you will. And then NAR, that we are all, I shouldn't say all, a lot of realtors are represented from the National Association of Realtors. And in that moment, NAR's response to that was, hold tight, the sky's not falling. We're gonna be preparing a case to dispute this. And so this entire time, we believed that that's exactly what was happening, that NAR was working on our behalf and that this case was going to be, disputed in court. And really, last Friday, the news was announced that essentially what I believe NAR was doing the entire time was creating a settlement. They were not forming a defense. They were creating a settlement. And then that was when the news hit on Friday about this $418 million, judgment. That, of course, it still has to go through the DOJ and stuff, but this is what we're looking at. And so this seems to be the logical conclusion of this case that's been going on since 2017.
Right. So for those consumers out there, we're really close to this in the real estate industry because it's been on our radar for quite some time. But this Sitzer-Burnett case, as I'm consulting the notes I took here, so it was a lawsuit that became class action status in the state of Missouri by a group of home sellers in that state who were alleging that it was against National Association of Realtors, or NAR. We'll probably just refer to that as NAR, and several large brokerages across the country. They were alleging that commissions were too high and that buyer brokers, so buyers agents, were paid too much, and that specific rules with the National Association of Realtors led to price fixing on what people were paid, where agents were paid in this process. And so that's what that case, just kind of the 10,000-foot view of that case. And then in October, I think it was Halloween, is when the case came to a verdict. The jury brought their verdict, which said that the ruling was in favor of the plaintiffs, or the people who were filing the lawsuit against NAR and all these big brokerages. So that's kind of the background of all of that. Mm-hmm. And what Bekki alluded to was in that background time between October and Friday the 15th, just this last Friday when all this broke loose, was what was going on behind the scenes that perhaps what was being negotiated all along was this settlement rather than the actual defense of what, for the industry or what the advocacy was for consumers. And rather than addressing that, it was about the settlement. So yes. So what is this settlement? My goodness, there's so much to talk about with this settlement. So the original damages that were, I guess, suggested as a result of this case was in the billions of dollars. And several of the large brokerages named were electing to settle, but the National Association of Realtors decided with this settlement that this is what they were going to do was create this settlement. So let me share my screen. I am going to show you. This was the news that broke. The New York Times broke the news. So this is the news that a lot of people saw. So $418 million settlement for damages, and also amending several rules that housing experts say will drive down housing costs. So we will dive into that further, what that actually means, if that actually is going to be the case. But as far as what is in that settlement, so here's the news. Sorry, bear with me. We're doing it live. So let me get my stuff organized here. Here we go. Sorry, bear with me. Here we go. Thanks for your patience. So this is from the National Association of Realtors website. Anybody can go online and find this with a quick Google search of just the National Association of Realtors, or NAR, settlement. And what they're saying is that there's a couple big things that are coming out of this. One of them is that anybody who's a National Association of Realtors member is going to be required to have a buyer broker representation agreement, which is a contractual agreement between a buyer and a buyer's agent. And that also, as far as compensation offers to a buyer or a buyer's agent from a seller, that can't be advertised on the MLS. So we're removing that being shown as something that folks can see to know what that compensation is being offered. Won't be on the MLS at all. So interesting enough. So that is where the news is getting a lot of these pieces wrong, but we will come back to that. So Bekki, what are your thoughts about the settlement as far as the amount of money, the rule changes? What goes through your mind when you see this particular news and this information from Friday?
Sure. So, it's interesting. I think that we've seen a lot of industries, real estate up to this point, somewhat excluded, that have experienced serious levels of disruption with the incoming force of different technology. And we've watched it change a lot of our landscape as to how we transact business on a day-to-day level. And I feel like for those of us who really seek to be informed and to truly be experts at what we do, I feel like this has been something that we've been talking about for a while, to say, hey, is there going to be a point that we begin to do business differently due to people being able to have better access to finding homes that are available? Back in our parents' day, if somebody wanted to use a buyer's agent, that buyer's agent used to have to drive to their brokerage on a weekend, get a book of listings, go and take it to their prospective clients. Can you imagine that every time you got an offer, you'd have to fax something in and go and potentially even get wet signatures, right?
Yeah.
So we've had a lot of changes over the last 3 decades, if you will, from our industry. And so I think that, as with anything, the only thing that's constant is change, right? And so I think that this was a reaction to somebody saying, to our group of people saying, as consumers, we would like to see some changes happen in this industry. Mm-hmm. And I think that for there's a lot of fairness in a consumer demanding change. So I'm not salty about that. I think that is just the nature of how business works. Things get better, things improve. Sometimes we've got to take a couple of steps back to move forward. So I'm not at all surprised that we are encountering this. And I feel like, you and I are part of the same coaching organization, and I feel like they've been prepping us for this moment for 3 years.
I would agree with that. I would
Yeah, so
absolutely agree with that.
I think if there's agents out there that were really caught off guard by this, I would say you're kind of asleep at the wheel.
Right.
And so, while there are implications of this that are not necessarily favorable, change is hard, right? Very few people lean into something new and just be like, oh, I can't wait to do this. I can't wait to relearn how to do something that I've been doing, in my opinion, effectively for 8 years. And so just encountering change can be really difficult. Change tends to really scare a lot of people. And we've seen a lot of that. Over the last, several days since this has came out, we've got realtors on all end of the spectrum. We've got people out there saying, I'll never work again. I've got to go find a different job. And we've got people over here with their head in the sand that just says, oh, business as usual, nothing changes at all. And I think both extremes are incorrect. Sure. I think that as professionals, that no matter what industry that we're in, we need to be primed and prepared to pivot. And so I think that, for us in the state of Tennessee, I understand that every state operates a little differently. We've always used buyer representation agreements.
Right.
Now, this verdict, depending on how it all shakes out with the DOJ, will affect at what point in the process we get these things signed. I could have gotten it signed the very first time that I ever met a buyer. Typically for me, I would get it signed at the time of writing an offer. And I would just explain to the buyer, this gives me permission to write an offer on your behalf and represent you through this transaction. Right. And so for some people from some states, buyers' representation agreements are completely new. It's something that they've never had as part of their repertoire at all. For us, it's like, yeah, we've already had those. We've used them on every transaction. It's just going to kind of change how and when it comes into play. And I think that, for if there is anybody, maybe the plaintiffs in this lawsuit, or perhaps even the attorneys, for anybody to take what is kind of shaken out from this and kind of beat their chest and say, we've really accomplished solving a complicated issue, I think is an incorrect assessment. Sure. I think that there did need to be more transparency around in our industry how agents get paid. You and I have both probably seen, people over the past several years, maybe it's an internet forum or whatever, where they're like, well, why wouldn't you work with a buyer's agent? They're paid, it's free to work with a buyer's agent. Right. The seller pays all of that.
That's the worst.
It's worse. And you're talking to somebody who does not truly understand. You're talking to somebody with a license who is spreading a false narrative and incorrect, incorrect information. And so I think that there has been a lot of murkiness to the consumer as to how agents do get paid. And so I think that if I could empathize at all with the point of this lawsuit, that I think that to the best of intentions, and I think there was a lot of ill intentions, but to the best of intentions, I think you may have had a group of people sitting there saying, we did not understand when we sold our home, we were not clear as to how compensation worked.
Absolutely. And to your point about these, so for the folks here locally, being, that I'm in Oregon and you're in Tennessee, and, here in the state of Oregon, it was never necessarily the law that we have one of these buyer broker representation agreements. It was always something that was available in our form library that we could fill out, but it was never required. And so a couple weeks ago here in Oregon, House Bill 4058 was passed, and that was a requirement. So they made some changes to a few things. One of the things they talked about in that bill at length was wholesaling, which if you're an investor in the real estate space, then you know what wholesaling is, but we won't go into that. But on the other half of that was they did address these buyer broker representations. And so they did pass the law that said in Oregon, it's now going to be required by law in the state of Oregon for that. So I think this lawsuit and the settlement and what the National Association of Realtors bringing to the table is saying, well, now if you're a member of NAR, then yes, now you have to use this as a member, part of the member body. But now our state has joined the ranks of others that are requiring this by law. And honestly, I think that at the end of the day, this agreement is for the betterment of that relationship with an agent and a consumer, because it sets a certain expectation of what an agent is doing, what they can do, and what we can't do. the buyer broker agreement in like our Oregon form library, one of them that I have access to is straightforward. And it just says, hey, consumer, you need to know that your agent's limited in their abilities and what they're actually able to do. They're not an attorney, they're not a CPA. And for anything that's above and beyond the scope of our license, we are going to refer you out to the appropriate professional that can help you with that advice and information. And so I think it's a good thing because
I think
it's
that
going
again,
to set those standards.
Yes, and I think that if giving somebody the immense benefit of the doubt from this lawsuit, I hope that there was a purity of intention to approach this and say, at the end of the day, what we're hoping to accomplish is to make this more clear to the consumer. And I do think that there was a lot of room there for that to take place and for that to be necessary. Unfortunately, I just have a belief that the bigger things tend to be, the bigger the lawsuit, the bigger the government, the bigger the company, the more room there is for a lot of waste. And so I think that the way that it has fallen out has not necessarily accomplished those pure intentions from the beginning. And, when you look at a $418 million lawsuit and you realize the attorney's fees represented 40% of that, that's $167 million that was a payday for attorneys that got together. Now, again, I think everybody deserves to be paid whenever they work. So that's neither here nor there. But I do find it interesting that, that the attorneys go into this saying, you've harmed the consumer. Consumers were not clear on how much this was going to cost them. All of these things that if they were to lay out kind of a litany of allegations against the residential real estate agent, I'd venture to say a lot of those same things could be turned around and said the same thing for them in this massive lawsuit for how much money that they made out of it. At that point, they're not fighting for this $418 million to go to harmed consumers. They're looking for a $167 million payday, and especially, and the reason why I feel the freedom or the right to even suggest that is because in the end, I do not believe that the actions taken are actually going to protect the consumer further. They have not moved that ball down the road, okay? Consumers are still going to be unclear as to how this all works, and there's going to be an education process that good agents should be prepared to have. But at the end of the day, if this would all play out the way that the people behind the lawsuit would prefer it to, I think that they would prefer that buyer's agents are solely paid for by the buyer, and that seller's agents or listing agents are solely paid by the listing agent or the seller. And I personally do not believe that that model is in the best interest of the buyer. And we can get into all the reasons why, but primarily I think that when you look at the most vulnerable population of people who are purchasing homes, they are first-time home buyers. And when you're going and buying your first home, you've got a tremendous amount of expenses loaded on the front end of that transaction. You're going to have closing costs, which can be up to 3% of your loan amount. You're going to have a down payment most of the time. I know there's different loan products, but a lot of times you're looking at 3.5% for that. So right off the bat, it's 6.5% maybe that they're having to come up with to come and buy a house. That's a tall order for somebody who is just saving every penny to come to the table. And then on top of that, you're saying, hey, by the way, if you want a licensed professional to be able to guide you through this process and protect your interests, you have to pay them on top of that, whatever their fee happens to be. And I think expecting first-time home buyers to foot the bill for all of those things is egregious. And I think where the consumer gets harmed potentially is when they come to the table and say, oh my gosh, I've saved all this money and I've got money for my closing costs and down payment. And, I'm probably going to have to buy a house that is going to require some repairs on top of that. And, we are limited on our budget here and we just do not have the funds to pay, to have representation. And so in those situations, let's play that out. What happens? Then they get into a legally binding agreement with with a party on the other side whose fiduciary responsibility is to act honestly and fairly. So that, and their primary role beyond acting honestly and ethically is to protect the seller's interest. It is to get the seller the most amount of money. It is to get the seller the best terms. And when you have a first-time home buyer, we're not talking about people who have bought and sold 5 homes. We're talking about somebody brand new to this industry or to this process. And as somebody who really that just fuels my tank in working with first-time buyers, that grieves me, because they're not going to know if they're being fleeced. They're not going to know if their offer is competitive. They are not going to know all the contract deadlines. Maybe their offers end up falling apart, or the contracts potentially end up falling apart, and they could lose earnest money because they didn't follow contractual timelines. They didn't get an inspection done within the number of days they were supposed to. They didn't turn in earnest money. They didn't know how to negotiate a repair amendment. And you've got all these ways. I mean, there's probably 30 potholes along the way potentially throughout a transaction where that consumer, that first-time homebuyer, will truly be harmed by not having representation. And so to put the onus on them that they have to come with a down payment, they've got to come with closing costs, and then on top of that, they have to pay for their own buyer's representation, I think is placing an undue burden on the most vulnerable of all of our home buyers. And it honestly just makes me sad. It makes me sad because I don't think that through the process of the shakedown of this $418 million lawsuit, I think that there's true harm that will come to the consumer. Jen, I think you're muted.
Yes, I am, because I was coughing. Yes. Yes. I've had my dog push the door open. I've had my daughter come in because it's baseball, like chaos. Oh, it's because it's live. That's what happens, right? This is reality. This is real life. So yes. And so at the end of the day, there's good that will come from this settlement, which, by the way, we need to note that this settlement is merely a proposal. The courts have not approved anything yet. So they could rip this thing up one side and down the other and come out with a final product on the other side that is different or has changes to what the association is basically presenting to everybody. The Department of Justice could come through and say, no, we don't like this, we don't like that, you need to go back to the drawing board, or they may accept it wholesale as it is. We just don't know. But one thing I want to take a second to do, because there's a lot of you watching this that are probably consumers. You're the person that is watching this from the sidelines. You're seeing it in the news and you're wondering, well, what are the economics of how the money flows in a real estate transaction with how agents are paid? And so when we talk about buyers agents and selling agents and stuff, I just want to make it very clear with what those relationships look like. So I have some quick graphics that I'm going to show, and we'll just go through this. Some people like to see things visually, so we'll also explain it as we go. So we have a house here. Everybody needs a place to live, right? So then if we get to this next piece is we have the same house. We have a seller. The sellers have the house, and we have the buyers on the other side, and these buyers want a house. And that's already the thing that they have in common. The sellers have the house that the buyers want to buy. So when the buyers come to the table, they write an offer, the seller accepts it, and they're under a contract to buy or sell, depending on which side they're on, to buy or sell that home to one another. So the buyers and the sellers, are in a contract to buy or sell that property. So where do agents enter this picture? So on the left in red, we have the buyers and their buyer's agent who's representing them. In theory, this is where this buyer-broker agreement comes in. This is a contractual agreement between the buyers and their agent. This is where the agent is going to say, if they're good at their job, is they're going to demonstrate their value. They're going to say, these are all the things I'm going to negotiate for you, buyer or buyers. And here's the limitations of my license, and I charge X%. This is my fee of what I charge for my services, of these things I'm going to do for you. So you, as a buyer, presumably you would be in that agreement with your agent. On the right, we have in purple, the sellers. They have their agent that's representing them. Just like with a buyer, you're in a contractual agreement with your agent if you're a seller, because they're saying, sellers, these are all the things I'm going to do to help you sell your property and negotiate on your behalf. They are in a contractual agreement with their agent. And then we put all the pieces together, all these colors. You have the buyers and the sellers, the house, they're in contract on the purchase or the sale of that house. And then we have the buyer's agent and the seller's agent. The negotiation happens on behalf of the buyers and sellers between their agents. That's how that all comes together. So who's really in contract with who? This should hopefully break that down of who is actually connected to who. So at the end of the day, with this settlement, we can just, I guess, start talking about some of this misinformation, because there's a lot of it out there.
There's a lot of it out there. And the crazy thing is that so much of this, right, is that, you know, they're wanting to separate. The fallout from this is that, you know, everybody needs to pay their own agents. And that buyers, more or less, you know, the sellers came forward and said, why are we required to pay somebody who is competing against our interest, right? That was the crux of the lawsuit. And first of all, as far as, and I'm not sure if this is across the board in every MLS, but it has always been a rule here in Tennessee on our MLSs that a seller could pay a buyer's agent $1 in cooperation. So you couldn't say zero, but you could pay them $1. Okay. Right. So to say that sellers have been fleeced through this process is incorrect. And also to say that real estate agent commissions have always been negotiated. Always.
Exactly. Always negotiable.
Yes. And if, you know, if NAR, who has data, could release what is the average commission for a buyer's agent across the board, it's not what the general public perceives. And I'm not even going to say that number because there is no set, but for what this, you know, with the headlines, as far as referencing this 6%, that is not the national average of what homes are selling at. There's no such thing. And I, you know, depending on different circumstances, I have been all over the board with what I have made percentage-wise on different deals and different transactions, depending on circumstances, right?
Absolutely.
And so this whole idea of that, and then the other thing that I feel like that when people say, well, buyers need to pay their own way, buyers have always paid their agent's commission.
Follow the money. If you follow the money, because the whole transaction, think of it this way, folks, the entire transaction, the sale would not be possible without the buyer bringing their money to the table to make the purchase. The buyer pays everything at the end of the day. So for a seller, you know, to say, well, I don't want to pay compensation for that buyer's agent, then it's well, the buyer's paying everything anyway. They're buying the whole package. Right.
At the top of the closing disclosure, you know, if you pay, if it's a $500,000 house, the very top line is going to be the sale price of that property. Correct. And then all the bills of the transaction get paid out of that. And then the seller gets what's left over. But the buyer has paid every penny of that. Right. And with the proceeds that they brought for closing, right? Right. And so again, has that been murky? Sure.
Yes.
Should we clear that up? Absolutely.
100%.
But these incendiary headlines of the days of the sellers paying the buyer's agent commission are over. You don't understand how our industry has worked, and maybe that's our fault. Honestly,
I would agree with that. And I would agree with that. I think that as an industry wholesale, we have not done a good job of explaining the economics of how we're paid or the movement of funds in this transaction to say the buyer and the buyer's agent are in contract together. As a seller, we're not here to tell the buyer what they're worth, the buyer's agent what they should be paid or what they're worth, because that's negotiated between their parties, those two. We're not in a contract with the buyer's agent. And the same with the listing. The listing agent's going to negotiate. We're not here to tell them what they're worth. That's between the seller and the agent to make that determination.
Yeah. And in that respect, let's say that in the past, if a seller was offering a certain amount of compensation that did not work for me as a buyer's agent, I have always had the right to go to my buyer and say, this does not work for me. This is my fee, and you're going to have to make up the difference. So I think my frustration from this lawsuit comes in the fact that at the end of the day, nothing has really been solved. Everything is still operating the same way. as far as the trickle down of it. Now, there is some logistical things that have changed as far as what can be on the MLS and what cannot.
Right.
But what frustrates me is that we've been doing this since 2017. They paid out $418 million, which, mind you, that doesn't include the other settlements from all the other big brokerages.
That's a whole other ball of wax.
But we're talking a lot of money, and it frustrates me to see so much time, effort, and money poured into something that does not actually enact positive change. And that is my overall opinion of what this entire thing is that I think it's posturing in the worst of ways, that you have a bunch of attorneys standing up saying, look at what we've accomplished for the common good. And I don't think that needle has changed. And
I agree, because I think it's adding further murkiness, as you would say. The word murky is very accurate here, because especially the misinformation that we've seen in the headlines, which is that, well, one of the big ones is, and a lot of comments and things I've seen on the internet is that, well, now a seller doesn't have to pay, they can't, it's not allowed for them to pay or make an offer of compensation, I should say, to that buyer's agent or whatever. And so that in theory, logistically, is that seller makes a pre-negotiated concession to say, hey, we're going to contribute this much percentage or whatever to the buyer, so they can pay the agent what their agent is owed for their services. It's not even like telling them what it's worth, because if that percentage doesn't cover what they negotiated, then it's still on the buyers to make up the difference. But it's not saying that sellers cannot make that offer. You can. Sellers, you are going to be able to do that. It cannot be advertised on the MLS. So if an agent wants to show your property, the buyer's agent is going to call your listing agent and say, are your sellers making an offer of compensation to a buyer's agent? And then it would be discussed that way. So it's just taking that knowledge offline, basically, and taking it back to the old fashioned, we have to have a conversation about it. We're going to have to negotiate and discuss that in phone calls, probably some documents we'll have to sign and things like that. But sellers still offer it. And as a matter of fact, I would argue that by offering this, it puts you at a competitive advantage. Ultimately, it's your decision, but there's no guarantee that every buyer that's going to be attracted to your property is going to be able to cover that. You're limiting the number of buyers that you're going to be bringing in. And there's no guarantee that your house is going to sell as quickly or for the same amount of money as
because fundamentally, if a buyer has to come in and they know that they have to pay a buyer's agent a significant fee in order for representation, I can guarantee you that will be reflected in the offer that they make for the property, right? And this is the other murky part of it is that most people buying homes that are getting loans are going to go through an appraisal process.
Yeah.
And an appraiser comes and says, all right, we're just for kicks and grins doing this on a hypothetical $500,000 house. An appraiser is going to come and they're going to look at the nuts and bolts of the house, the location, the size of the lot, all of these things to make into a cumulative value of what this property is worth. Okay. Well, what happens, real estate commissions are never factored into that conversation.
Right.
A home is worth $500,000 if that seller sells to his best friend and neither one of them use agents. It is worth $500,000 if they paid 10% to realtors. It's worth $500,000. None of that changes the actual value of the home, but it becomes a different conversation with what a buyer is going to be willing to pay if they know that built into their upfront transaction costs, because agent fees used to be kind of on the back end to where it was part of their loan amount.
Right.
And now if it's going to have to be something that is paid out of pocket by them, that changes the entire conversation.
Everything.
And what's crazy about it is that if, for most people getting 30-year loans, let's say that a realtor's commission is $10,000. Well, $10,000 in a 30-year mortgage is peanuts on a monthly payment. But somebody happened to come up with $10,000 cash at closing is an entirely different ballgame. And so it's twisted. The dynamic has shifted, And while some sellers could be saying, man, this is the best thing that's ever happened for me in real estate, there's a lot of misinformation that says that it's going to drive home prices down.
Right.
No, it won't, because that house is still worth $500,000. It's still appraised for that,
Right.
And so this whole idea that suddenly if people aren't using agents, that it's going to bring that down. Nobody's going to willingly say, well, I had an appraisal 6 months ago and my house appraised for this or that. But because I'm not going to use an agent, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to make some deductions. Yes. That's
nobody's going to do
that.
Sellers, if that's you and that's your idea, you think that that's something you're willing to do, leave us a comment here and tell us if you're willing to drop the price of your house if you know you're not going to have to pay an agent.
To me, what's silly about that, right, is that might be the same group of sellers who are like, we were forced to cooperate, but we're going to drop the price if we don't have to. 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It's the same money. What are we doing? This makes no sense.
Right. And I think so. No, I think the assessment that we have as professionals in the industry is that this is not going to drop prices on homes for anybody, for sellers or for people looking to buy. I think if anything, it's going to change the conversations that need to be had around this issue. And it's also going to change, with lenders, because right now a VA buyer, we talked about first-time home buyers who bring their cash to the table. It's going to be a VA buyers. There's going to need to be some creative solutions with that also, because a VA buyer is disallowed from paying their agent. They're not, to use a VA loan. It's, and those folks who have that benefit, who've earned it by serving their country, they're going to suddenly also be removed from the equation on many of these homes because they're taking advantage of an amazing benefit they've earned as part of their service to the United States. So I don't know. There's so many layers to all of this, but the bottom line, the misinformation you're seeing, the recap of that is that yes, sellers, you may offer compensation to the buyer's agent. You're able to have that offer and discuss that with your agent when you list your property. It just cannot be advertised on the MLS. It's going to have to be discussed between the agents when they set up the showing appointment or they're calling to find information. It's going to mean more communication from agents to agents. So if you're not comfortable making phone calls and you're an agent and you don't want to call other agents, then why are you in this job, first of all? Then it's also the other piece to address is no, housing prices will not change because of this. Because in the way the world works, nobody's going to purposely reduce the price of their property to say, well, I don't have to pay a buyer's agent, so I'm going to reduce the price of my house $10,000. Nobody's going to do that and leave
people
that
are not that no people are not that altruistic.
No. And maybe some people will, and good for them. It's your house. At the end of the day, it's your property. You make that decision. As agents, we're your consultant. We bring you the data. We discuss pros and cons. We discuss different pricing strategies. And if that's what you want to do, then that's your decision. You can do what you want with your money and your property, essentially. But I really don't think people are going to be jumping up and down to leave money on the table in that way. Right. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing is too is that I think that it could be argued that sellers will still continue to be heavily incentivized to pay a buyer's agent. And it's not difficult to explain to a seller why that is still in their best interest to do this, right? If you had 3 homes on the same street that were all comparable properties and they're all listed at $500,000, which one do you think is going to sell first?
Right.
You've got, Mr. Smith over there who's saying, I'm not paying a buyer's agent anything. They're buyers, that they can pay for their own agent. And then you've got the guy next door who's offering, fill in the blank. And then the guy down the street who's offering even more. And if we're all talking about a similar property, buyers are going to go into the deal that makes the most sense for them.
That helps them achieve their goals. Yeah.
Yes. And our goal as agents has always been to present these properties for sale in their best light at the highest competitive advantage. Right. And so if you sit there and say, as a seller, I am not willing to do that, okay, Mr. Seller, I can work with that. I'm happy to list your home, but I will let you know that I've called on the other 5 homes currently available in the neighborhood, and they are offering to pay buyer's agent compensation. So just know when we get an offer, it may be reflective of the fact that a buyer's having to bring several $1,000s to the table.
Right.
And you know, and again, this is an industry that is this broad and this many moving pieces. There's a quote that says that large ships, like it takes a while to turn a large ship, right?
Exactly.
I do think that we have been seeing a compression of commission over the last 5 years.
Yeah.
I feel like we're seeing this shrink, and we're seeing it be different plans, different models of how agents get paid. That's not a new thing. And I feel like this is continuing down that trajectory of a further compression to real estate agent commissions. And honestly, there is a need for a bit of culling the herd. From somebody who you know, both of us who strive to be excellent and stay on top of of what we're doing, and knowing what I bring to the table. You and I have both had the opportunity, perhaps, to work with agents on the other side who maybe never would pick up the phone. Or, you know, it took them, you know, until the week before closing to get the documents that you needed, so you had a complete file. We've all had experiences of working with agents on the other side that, honestly, when I look at this and say they could not do a value proposition to get themselves out of a wet paper bag.
Right.
You know, and I'm here for that. I am here for their inability to show up and say, this is my value, this is what I offer, and this is the price that I demand to do these things.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
I'm not, that doesn't leave me shaking in my boots at the opportunity to do that, because that is what I have done for the last 8 years with my clients.
Right. 100%. And I think too, don't forget, folks, that at the end of the day, who you work with matters. Interview agents, see who is going to best achieve your goals. Maybe for you, the cheapest option is the best, and that's fine. But do yourself a favor and understand who it is that you're working with, because a good agent is going to be so much more to you than just somebody who opens a door and writes the piece of paper and sends it off to submit an offer. It's right. There's so much more to it, and shame on us as an industry if we have not done an adequate job of relaying that value and the hundreds of points of negotiation that could come up over the course of that transaction.
Yes. And it's fair to say too that if you go for decades, in NAR is sitting on this data, but for decades it has been a historic, significant fact that sellers who hire full service real estate agents to market their property and negotiate their best interest net, not gross, they net more money than people who do not. Right. Either people who hire flat fee brokerages, people who pay MLS listing only. There's a lot of different models out there, but categorically across the board, when sellers choose to work with full service agents and they are paying a buyer's agent, that is the best case scenario for that seller being able to net the most amount of money. And so that just speaks again to who you work with does matter. We are not all created equal, and not all of these models are going to work for somebody. You know, I have had clients and circumstances before where they were in distress. And there were times that it was like, okay, you know what, in this moment, in this market, selling to an e-buyer was what made the most sense for them. The conversation was not, are you getting top dollar? The conversation may have been, I need a definite closing date in 2 weeks because I've had a massive, you know, my life is blowing up. And there are circumstances in which those are good options. And I love having a free and open marketplace that allows consumers to make choices. That is a good thing. But we're not going away. The full service agent that is sitting there and saying, hey, I'm going to walk you through this entire transaction. And you know what? I unapologetically get paid well for what I do. I do not stand in shame of that, because when I'm working with a client, this is a unique industry in the fact that when I'm working with a client, most of the time here, that's 30 to 45 days. Jen, they have almost unparalleled access to me.
Yeah, 100%.
I am available to them just about 24/7. I'm not answering the phone at midnight, but I have taken late night phone calls. I have interrupted my own children's birthday parties.
Yes.
There is a cost associated in the fact that
100%.
it is not this, oh, I'm picking up the phone at 8 and after 5 p.m.,
I'm done.
you're not in my mind anymore. I'm going to go home and enjoy a nice leisurely night with my family. That's not how this industry works.
Right.
And when
100%.
you have me for 30 or 45 days, sometimes 60 or 90 days, you have access to my experience and my knowledge around the clock for practical purposes.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine any other industry that gives so much of an individual's time and attention. And so when I sit there and say, all right, I know what my time is worth and I know what my knowledge is worth and the fact that I'm bringing years of experience to this,
Yeah.
I'm not jumping in the pool to sit there and say, I'm going to discount dramatically my rates to do this. And I believe that I have developed enough business acumen and relationships locally that my clients are going to continue to pay me what I charge. I'm not worried about that.
Yeah. And I think it's a matter of how is that value that you're bringing to the table communicated, and how organized
100%.
is that, and how adequately are you able to say, this is what I do that I'm confident that no other agent in this area is going to be able to do and deliver for you. It's not just my experience, but it's also this whole other list of things. Like when we don't see a property on the MLS or that's active that works for you, and we've seen everything, then what are we going to do to try to find it? Because we're not just going to give up or just wait. If you have a timeline, what are some tools? What are some resources and things that we're going to put in place that will benefit you as a buyer, that are going to help assure that you get into the home that you want to get into sooner than later? So it's all these sorts of things. And I think that we've covered just about everything that we can possibly cover. What do you think? Any final parting thoughts other than I think who you work with matters? My dog made her way in here with the door opening and she's barking. This is chaos. Sometimes this is real life. When you work in your home and you're recording this, you got dogs barking, kids coming in anyway.
You know what? I think it's just a testament to what I just said. You know, you're doing this right now. This is working hours for you. It is currently 8:18 Central Standard Time, and I have very much my work hat on. You know, and I think that we're very fortunate to be able to do things as a living that we do genuinely enjoy doing. I'm very blessed to be able to do that. But at the end of the day, I'm still working at 8 p.m., you know, on a Wednesday night, you know?
Yes,
and so 100%. I think that as you're trying to manage baseball schedules and your dog and your kids and all of this, you're still pumping it out, right?
Still doing it.
And so I think at the end of the day, right, we talk a lot about how we're going to pivot, how we're going to react to change. And I think that for agents, it's going to be a thing of just, you know, we talk about this through our coaching, but, you know, not being a cow when they sense a storm coming is going to run with the storm, and thereby they are actually, you know, lengthening their time of discomfort because they're trying to run away from it. And I think that the best
running into the storm.
Yeah, and running into it, going in opposite direction to where when it passes over you, it's going to pass over you quickly. And I'm just so grateful for resources like this that is, you know, that is also serving both the consumer and in our industry to be able to inform. And you do such a great job with this. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for being on here. And I think if any folks have questions, always reach out to somebody who is competent and confident in what this conversation is about. Because again, there's so much misinformation, and read past the headlines. At the very least, read past the headlines, because those are meant to hook you in and make you inflamed and irate and curious. And the headline isn't the story. It's the headline. It's just the headline. Right. So thank you so much, Bekki, for joining today. And, I'm Jennifer Scherter with Real Broker. I'm a real estate expert here in the Clackamas County area of Oregon, serving the North Willamette Valley and the Portland, Oregon Metro. And if you're looking to make a move around here, look me up. My details will be here. Follow me here on YouTube. Subscribe to my channel. And we'll see you next week at Real Estate Recess. Have a great week, everyone.
See ya.